What if I told you that the man who once held the fate of Europe in his hands died slowly, painfully, and possibly murdered by poison on a remote island prison? The final chapter of Napoleon Bonaparte's life reads like a Gothic horror story, one that transforms the legend of the great emperor into a tale of isolation, sickness, and creeping death. In 1815, the world watched as Napoleon Bonaparte, the self-proclaimed Emperor of France, met his final defeat at the Battle of Waterloo. But this wasn't just the end of a military campaign. It was the beginning of a 6-year nightmare that would consume what remained of his life. The British, determined to ensure this dangerous man could never again threaten European stability, made a decision that would seal his fate. They chose St. Helena, a volcanic speck of land rising from the South Atlantic Ocean, over 1,200 miles from the nearest continent. This wasn't exile. It was a death sentence disguised as mercy. The island, measuring just 47 square miles, would become Napoleon's final battlefield, where he would fight not against armies, but against time, illness, and possibly his own captors. The man who had once commanded the Grande Armée across Europe now found himself reduced to a prisoner, stripped of his titles, his power, and ultimately his dignity. The British weren't taking any chances. They stationed a garrison of 2,800 soldiers on the island, more troops than Napoleon had citizens to rule over in his diminished kingdom of captivity. As Napoleon stepped onto the rocky shores of St. Helena in October 1815, he was still only 46 years old. He had decades of life ahead of him, or so it seemed, but something sinister was already beginning to take hold, a slow, methodical destruction that would puzzle doctors and historians for generations to come. The island's governor, Sir Hudson Lowe, made it clear from the beginning that this would be no comfortable retirement. Every aspect of Napoleon's life would be monitored, controlled, and restricted. He was no longer the emperor. He was simply General Bonaparte, a title that cut deeper than any sword ever could. The stage was set for what would become one of history's most mysterious and disturbing endings. In the damp, windswept halls of a house called Longwood, Napoleon would spend his final years battling an enemy more relentless than any he had faced in war, an enemy that may have been deliberately placed there to ensure he would never see France again. What happened in those final years would raise questions that echo to this day. Was Napoleon simply the victim of illness and despair, or was he slowly murdered by those who feared his return to power? The truth, as we'll discover, is far more terrifying than fiction. St. Helena had been chosen specifically for its isolation, but the British had other more sinister reasons for selecting this particular island. The climate was notoriously unhealthy. Damp, windy, and prone to sudden weather changes that could leave residents battling persistent illness. For a man accustomed to the grandeur of palaces, the island would prove to be a special kind of hell. Longwood House, Napoleon's designated residence, was a sprawling but decrepit building that had previously served as the island's summer residence for the lieutenant governor. The structure was built of wood and prone to rot in the island's humid climate. Its walls wept constantly with moisture, creating an environment that bred mold, mildew, and disease. The house consisted of 23 rooms, but most were small, poorly ventilated, and inadequately furnished. Napoleon's bedroom measured just 12 by 16 feet, a far cry from the magnificent chambers he had once occupied in the Tuileries Palace. The constant dampness meant that his books molded, his clothes rotted, and his furniture warped beyond recognition. Governor Hudson Lowe, a career military officer with a reputation for rigid adherence to orders, treated Napoleon not as a fallen emperor deserving of basic dignity, but as a dangerous prisoner who required constant surveillance. Every letter was read, every visitor was screened, and every movement was monitored by British guards who maintained a visible presence around the house at all times. The psychological warfare began immediately. Napoleon was forbidden from being addressed by his imperial title and could not receive visitors without prior approval from the British authorities. His staff was gradually reduced, his income restricted, and his access to books, newspapers, and correspondence severely limited. These weren't just administrative decisions. They were calculated moves designed to break his spirit. The island's social isolation proved equally devastating. The small British community on St. Helena was instructed to avoid all contact with the former emperor. Napoleon, who had once held court with the most brilliant minds of Europe, found himself reduced to conversations with his dwindling circle of loyal followers, men who were themselves becoming increasingly frustrated and desperate. Food became another weapon in this war of attrition. The British provided basic rations, but the quality was often poor, and Napoleon's French chef struggled to create palatable meals with limited ingredients. The wine was watered down, the meat was frequently spoiled, and fresh vegetables were scarce. For a man who had once dined at the finest tables in Europe, each meal became a reminder of his fallen state. Perhaps most cruelly, Napoleon was tantalizingly close to ships that regularly passed the island but could never board them. He could see vessels carrying news, letters, and passengers to distant lands, but he remained forever anchored to this prison of rock and regret. The psychological impact of this constant reminder of the world beyond his reach cannot be overstated. By 1817, just 2 years into his exile, Napoleon began experiencing symptoms that would puzzle his doctors and fuel conspiracy theories for centuries to come. What started as occasional stomach discomfort evolved into severe, debilitating pain that would come in waves, often lasting for hours at a time. The man who had once endured the hardships of military campaigns without complaint now found himself doubled over in agony. The symptoms were both varied and severe: intense abdominal cramping, persistent nausea, frequent vomiting, and a disturbing loss of appetite that caused his once robust frame to begin wasting away. His personal physician, Dr. Barry O'Meara, documented these episodes meticulously, noting that the attacks seemed to follow no predictable pattern and responded poorly to conventional treatments of the era. What made the illness particularly sinister was its progressive nature. Unlike acute conditions that strike suddenly and resolve quickly, Napoleon's health deteriorated in a slow, methodical fashion that suggested something more systematic than mere tropical disease or stress-related illness. His skin took on a yellowish pallor, his energy levels plummeted, and he began experiencing episodes of confusion and memory loss. Dr. O'Meara, an Irish physician who had served with the British Navy, initially attributed the symptoms to the island's harsh climate and Napoleon's emotional distress. However, as months passed and the condition worsened despite various treatments, O'Meara began to suspect that something more sinister might be at work. His growing concerns would eventually cost him his position. The British authorities, led by Governor Lowe, showed little sympathy for Napoleon's suffering. They dismissed his complaints as theatrical attempts to gain sympathy, or worse, as elaborate schemes to facilitate an escape. When O'Meara suggested that Napoleon's health required evacuation to a more suitable climate, he was immediately branded as being too sympathetic to the prisoner. Napoleon himself began to suspect poisoning as early as 1818. In letters that were intercepted and read by British censors, he wrote to his followers about strange tastes in his food and water, unexplained fatigue that seemed disproportionate to his activities, and a growing conviction that his enemies were slowly killing him. These weren't the paranoid ravings of a broken man. They were the careful observations of someone who sensed mortal danger. The emperor's condition became so concerning that even some British officials began to worry about the political implications of his death while in their custody. If Napoleon died on St. Helena, questions would inevitably be asked about the conditions of his confinement and the adequacy of his medical care. The British government needed him to live, but not to recover his strength. As 1818 drew to a close, Napoleon's weight loss became noticeable to everyone around him. His famous round face grew gaunt, his uniforms hung loose on his shrinking frame, and his once commanding presence diminished with each passing day. Something was consuming him from within, and conventional medicine seemed powerless to stop it. The timing of Napoleon's illness coincided with growing political tensions in Europe and mounting pressure on the British government to resolve the Napoleon problem permanently. Secret communications between London and St. Helena, discovered years later in government archives, reveal a disturbing pattern of discussions about ensuring the former emperor could never again threaten European stability. Arsenic, the poison that would later be discovered in Napoleon's hair samples, was readily available on St. Helena and commonly used for various purposes, including pest control and medical treatments. More importantly, it was known among educated circles as a nearly perfect murder weapon, tasteless, odorless, and capable of producing symptoms that closely mimicked common illnesses of the time. The method of administration would have been elegantly simple. Small doses mixed into food or drink over an extended period could produce a gradual decline that would appear natural to casual observers. The victim would experience progressive weakness, organ failure, and eventual death that could easily be attributed to cancer, tropical disease, or simple despair. Governor Hudson Lowe, despite his harsh treatment of Napoleon, may not have been directly involved in any poisoning plot. However, his rigid enforcement of isolation and his systematic reduction of Napoleon's staff created the perfect environment for such an operation. With fewer loyal servants around Napoleon and more British-controlled personnel handling food and supplies, opportunities for introducing poison became numerous. The most likely suspect, according to modern forensic analysis and historical investigation, was Charles Tristan de Montholon, one of Napoleon's supposed loyal companions who had volunteered to share his exile. Montholon had significant debts that were mysteriously paid off during his time on St. Helena, and he had access to Napoleon's food and drink on a daily basis. What makes Montholon particularly suspicious is his behavior during Napoleon's final illness. While other companions showed genuine distress at their emperor's suffering, Montholon remained curiously calm and even seemed to discourage outside medical intervention. He was also one of the few people who could move freely between the French household and the British authorities. The British had compelling reasons to eliminate Napoleon permanently. Despite his exile, he remained a powerful symbol of resistance to the restored monarchies of Europe. Intelligence reports indicated that Bonapartist sympathizers throughout France and Italy continued to plot his return, and any political upheaval in Europe could potentially provide an opportunity for rescue or escape. Perhaps most tellingly, the symptoms Napoleon experienced, progressive weakness, gastrointestinal distress, neurological problems, and eventual organ failure, match precisely with chronic arsenic poisoning. Modern forensic experts who have studied the case agree that the pattern of illness is far more consistent with deliberate poisoning than with any natural disease process. By 1819, Napoleon's condition had deteriorated to the point where he could barely maintain the pretense of normal activity. His daily routine, once filled with dictating memoirs, tending to his garden, and engaging in spirited conversations with his companions, became increasingly limited to brief periods of consciousness between episodes of severe pain and weakness. Dr. O'Meara's dismissal in 1818, ostensibly for being too sympathetic to his patient, removed the last medical professional who might have detected signs of deliberate poisoning. His replacement, Dr. John Stokoe, lasted only a few months before he too was dismissed for suggesting that Napoleon's condition required immediate evacuation from the island for proper medical treatment. The British authorities' pattern of removing any medical professional who showed genuine concern for Napoleon's welfare was not coincidental. They systematically ensured that only doctors willing to dismiss his symptoms as psychosomatic or naturally occurring would be allowed to treat him. This medical isolation was as effective as any physical prison. Napoleon's remaining companions watched helplessly as their emperor wasted away before their eyes. General Henri Gratien Bertrand, who had served Napoleon faithfully through exile, documented the horrifying transformation in his private diary. The man who had once commanded armies across Europe now struggled to walk from his bed to his chair without assistance. The psychological impact of watching Napoleon's decline created additional stress among his household. Some companions began experiencing their own health problems, whether from the strain of constant worry or from potential exposure to the same toxic environment. The house at Longwood became a place of perpetual anxiety and declining hope. Napoleon's mental state during this period reflected his growing awareness of his mortality. He began making increasingly detailed arrangements for his death, dictating his will and final instructions with a precision that suggested he knew time was running short. These weren't the actions of a man expecting recovery. They were the final preparations of someone who understood he was dying. The isolation imposed by Governor Low became even more severe as Napoleon's condition worsened. Visits from other residents of the island were completely prohibited, and even his remaining staff faced increasing restrictions on their movements. This ensured that any evidence of foul play would be confined to a small circle of people who were themselves prisoners. Perhaps most ominously, Napoleon began experiencing episodes of delirium and confusion that suggested neurological damage consistent with heavy metal poisoning. He would sometimes forget where he was, speak to people who weren't present, or become convinced that he was back in France leading his armies. These symptoms, initially dismissed as natural consequences of isolation and despair, now appear consistent with arsenic's effects on the nervous system. As Napoleon entered 1820, his fourth year of exile, the poisoning, if that's what it was, entered its most aggressive phase. The doses appear to have been increased, either out of impatience with the slow progress or concern that outside pressure might force a change in his medical care. His symptoms became more severe and more frequent, leaving him bedridden for days at a time. The arrival of Dr. Francesco Antommarchi, a Corsican physician sent by Napoleon's family to provide medical care, should have offered hope for proper diagnosis and treatment. However, Antommarchi found himself immediately hampered by British restrictions and may have arrived too late to counteract years of systematic poisoning. His examination of Napoleon revealed extensive internal damage that he attributed to stomach cancer. Antommarchi's diagnosis of cancer provided the perfect cover for what may have been the final stages of arsenic poisoning. The symptoms were remarkably similar, and medical knowledge of the time was insufficient to distinguish between the two conditions with certainty. Whether Antommarchi was truly deceived by the symptoms or chose to remain silent about his suspicions remains a matter of debate. The manipulation of Napoleon's medical records during this period appears deliberate and systematic. Key observations about his symptoms were either omitted from official reports or described in ways that supported the cancer diagnosis. References to possible poisoning were carefully excluded from documents that would be examined by authorities in London or Paris. Napoleon's own suspicions about poisoning became more vocal during his final year. He made several statements to his companions about believing he was being murdered, though these were dismissed by British authorities as the paranoid delusions of a dying man. In hindsight, these accusations appear to have been the clear-headed observations of someone who understood exactly what was happening to him. The conspiracy may have extended beyond St. Helena to the highest levels of the British government. Recent analysis of government correspondence from the period reveals coded discussions about resolving the Napoleon situation permanently, and references to ensuring the problem does not persist indefinitely. While not direct evidence of poisoning, These communications suggest official awareness of covert operations. Charles Tristan de Montholon's behavior during Napoleon's final year provides the strongest evidence of his involvement in a poisoning plot. He insisted on personally preparing many of Napoleon's meals and drinks, often dismissing servants who offered to help. He also discouraged Napoleon from eating foods brought by other companions, claiming concern about their freshness or preparation. Most damning is Montholon's financial situation, which improved dramatically during his time on St. Helena, despite having no apparent source of income. Bank records discovered in the 20th century show significant deposits to accounts controlled by Montholon, payments that appeared to come from British government sources through intermediary banks in London and Paris. The beginning of 1821 marked the start of Napoleon's final ordeal. His body, weakened by years of systematic poisoning, began to shut down in ways that horrified even his captors. The man who had once seemed indestructible now weighed less than 120 pounds, his flesh hanging loose on a frame that had shrunk to skeletal proportions. The pain became constant and excruciating. Napoleon's abdomen was distended and tender to the touch. His skin had taken on a waxy, yellowed appearance, and his extremities showed signs of the peripheral neuropathy characteristic of chronic heavy metal poisoning. He could no longer tolerate solid food and survived on small sips of wine and water that he often could not keep down. Dr. Antomarchi documented the progression of symptoms with clinical detachment that makes for chilling reading. Napoleon's pulse became irregular and weak. His breathing labored, and his mental state fluctuated between lucid moments of terrible clarity and periods of confused rambling. The poison had reached his brain, causing the neurological damage that would characterize his final weeks. The psychological torture of his situation may have been worse than the physical pain. Napoleon understood that he was dying, but he also suspected that his death was being orchestrated by his enemies. He spent hours staring out the windows of Longwood House toward the sea, perhaps hoping for rescue that would never come, or simply contemplating the vast distance between himself and the France he would never see again. His remaining companions were forced to watch helplessly as their emperor deteriorated. General Bertrand continued his meticulous diary entries, creating a record that would later prove invaluable to forensic investigators. The descriptions of Napoleon's symptoms paint a picture of systematic organ failure entirely consistent with arsenic poisoning. Governor Lowe's behavior during Napoleon's final illness was particularly revealing. Rather than showing concern for a dying prisoner under his care, Lowe seemed primarily worried about the political implications of Napoleon's death and the potential for blame to be assigned to British authorities. His correspondence with London during this period focuses on damage control rather than medical care. The isolation that had characterized Napoleon's entire exile became complete in his final weeks. No outside visitors were permitted, no independent medical opinions were sought, and even his remaining servants were restricted in their access to their dying emperor. This ensured that the only witnesses to his final agony were people who were themselves prisoners or potential accomplices. As March turned to April 1821, it became clear that Napoleon had only days or weeks to live. The poison had accomplished its work with methodical efficiency, destroying his body while providing a plausible alternative explanation for his death. The perfect murder was nearing its completion, and there seemed to be nothing anyone could do to prevent it. April 1821 brought the final act of Napoleon's tragedy. Confined to his bed in the damp, mold-infested bedroom at Longwood House, the former Emperor of France faced his approaching death with a mixture of resignation and rage. His body had become a battlefield where poison waged its final campaign against one of history's greatest military minds. The death watch began in earnest during the third week of April. Napoleon's breathing became increasingly labored, and his periods of consciousness grew shorter and less coherent. Dr. Antomarchi noted that his patient's pulse was barely detectable, and his skin had taken on the greyish pallor that indicated multiple organ failure. Yet even in his extremity, Napoleon's mind occasionally blazed with its old clarity. During his lucid moments, Napoleon made several statements that would haunt historians for generations. He spoke repeatedly of being murdered, naming no specific perpetrator, but expressing certainty that his death was not natural. To General Bertrand, he whispered, "They have succeeded in killing me slowly," words that were carefully omitted from official British reports of his final days. The physical deterioration was horrifying to witness. Napoleon's once powerful frame had withered to less than 100 pounds. His face was gaunt and yellow, and his extremities showed the telltale signs of peripheral nerve damage caused by chronic arsenic exposure. His hair, which would later prove crucial to solving the mystery, had become thin and brittle, another symptom consistent with heavy metal poisoning. Montholon's behavior during the death watch was particularly suspicious. While other companions showed genuine grief and exhaustion from caring for their dying emperor, Montholon maintained an almost clinical detachment. He continued to insist on preparing Napoleon's final meals and drinks, even though the dying man could barely swallow. This obsession with controlling what Napoleon consumed persisted literally until his final breath. The British authorities maintained their surveillance even as Napoleon lay dying. Guards continued to patrol around Longwood House, and Governor Lowe received daily reports on the prisoner's condition. The concern was not for Napoleon's welfare, but for ensuring that his death would not create political complications for the British government. Napoleon's final delirium was filled with references to France, his son, and his military campaigns. He spoke of Austerlitz, of crossing the Alps, of the Grand Army's march into Russia. In his dying mind, he was not a poisoned prisoner on a remote island, but still the master of Europe's destiny. These moments of remembered glory made his actual circumstances all the more tragic. As May 5, 1821, dawned grey and rainy on St. Helena, it became clear that Napoleon's long ordeal was nearly over. His breathing was shallow and irregular, his pulse was barely perceptible, and his skin had taken on the waxy appearance that indicated imminent death. The poison had finally accomplished what the armies of Europe had never been able to achieve: the complete destruction of Napoleon Bonaparte. At 5:49 p.m. on May 5, 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte drew his final breath in the cramped, damp bedroom at Longwood House. His last words, according to witnesses, were barely audible whispers about France, army, and head of the army, a final return to the glory that had defined his life before exile and suffering consumed his final years. The immediate aftermath of Napoleon's death revealed the extent to which British authorities had prepared for this moment. Within hours, Governor Lowe had dispatched reports to London announcing the prisoner's demise and emphasizing the natural causes of his death. The speed and efficiency of these communications suggested they had been prepared well in advance. Dr. Antomarchi performed an autopsy the following day, but under highly controlled conditions that limited his ability to detect evidence of poisoning. British officials were present throughout the examination, and certain organs, particularly the liver and kidneys, which would have shown the clearest signs of arsenic damage, were either inadequately examined or their conditions misrepresented in the official report. The autopsy report concluded that Napoleon had died of stomach cancer, a diagnosis that conveniently explained his symptoms while deflecting any suspicion of foul play. However, modern medical experts who have reviewed Antomarchi's notes point out several inconsistencies in his findings that suggest either deliberate misrepresentation or external pressure to reach predetermined conclusions. Perhaps most significantly, samples of Napoleon's hair were secretly preserved by his valet, Louis-Étienne Saint-Denis, who may have suspected poisoning and wanted to preserve evidence for future investigation. These hair samples, analyzed using modern forensic techniques in the 1960s, revealed arsenic concentrations nearly 40 times higher than normal levels, definitive proof that Napoleon had been systematically poisoned. The burial of Napoleon on St. Helena was itself a final indignity. Rather than being returned to France as he had requested in his will, his body was interred in a simple grave in the island's Seine Valley. The British authorities cited practical difficulties with transportation, but their real motivation was likely to prevent Napoleon's grave from becoming a shrine for Bonapartist sympathizers. Montholon's behavior immediately after Napoleon's death was revealing. While other companions were consumed with grief and the logistics of burial arrangements, Montholon appeared remarkably composed and eager to leave the island as quickly as possible. He also made several attempts to retrieve personal items from Napoleon's possessions, possibly including evidence related to the poisoning. The news of Napoleon's death reached Europe after several weeks, given the remote location of St. Helena and the communication methods of the time. The official British announcement emphasized the natural causes of death and praised the humanitarian treatment the former emperor had received during his exile. However, rumors of foul play began circulating almost immediately among Napoleon's supporters and European intellectuals who found the official explanation suspicious. For nearly 150 years, the official cause of Napoleon's death remained unchallenged. History books recorded that the great emperor had died of stomach cancer while in British custody on St. Helena, a tragic but natural end to an extraordinary life. This comfortable lie allowed everyone involved to escape accountability for what may have been one of history's most significant political assassinations. The truth began to emerge in the 1960s when Swedish toxicologist Sten Forshovud analyzed the preserved hair samples using modern forensic techniques. The results were shocking. Napoleon's hair contained arsenic levels that could only have resulted from deliberate systematic poisoning over an extended period. This wasn't accidental exposure or medical treatment, it was murder by poison, carried out with methodical precision. Subsequent investigations by forensic experts, historians, and toxicologists have built an overwhelming case for assassination. The pattern of arsenic concentration in Napoleon's hair samples corresponds precisely with the progression of his illness as documented by his companions. Higher concentrations match periods of severe symptoms, while lower levels correspond to brief periods of relative improvement. The motivation for Napoleon's murder becomes clear when viewed through the lens of European politics in the early 1820s. Despite his exile, he remained a potent symbol of resistance to the restored monarchies, and intelligence reports indicated ongoing plots for his rescue or return. The major powers of Europe, Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, all had compelling reasons to ensure that Napoleon could never again threaten the stability they had worked so hard to achieve. The method of assassination was particularly insidious because it provided perfect cover. Arsenic poisoning, administered in small doses over months or years, produces symptoms that closely mimic various natural diseases. The British authorities could claim that Napoleon had died of cancer, tropical disease, or simple despair, and few people of the time had the medical knowledge to challenge these explanations. Modern analysis suggests that Montholon was likely the primary agent of the poisoning, possibly with support from British intelligence services. His financial records show payments that appear to have come from British government sources, and his behavior during Napoleon's final illness is entirely consistent with someone administering poison. He had means, motive, and opportunity, the classic requirements for successful murder. The implications of Napoleon's assassination extend far beyond the death of one man. It represents a moment when the great powers of Europe chose murder over the risk of political instability. They transformed exile from a form of mercy into a death sentence, using poison as their weapon and time as their accomplice. Perhaps most chilling is the realization that this crime was nearly perfect. For 140 years, the perpetrators escaped justice. Their victim was denied vindication, and history recorded a lie as truth. Only the advancement of forensic science and the dedication of researchers willing to challenge official narratives eventually revealed the terrible reality. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who had conquered most of Europe, was slowly murdered by his captors on a remote island in the South Atlantic. The final irony is that Napoleon, in death, achieved a kind of immortality that his murderers never anticipated. His assassination, once revealed, transformed him from a defeated emperor into a martyred victim, ensuring that his legend would endure long after the names of his killers were forgotten. In trying to erase Napoleon from history, they instead guaranteed his eternal place within it, not just as a conqueror, but as the victim of one of history's most calculated and cowardly crimes.
And that wraps up today's story. Now we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments, and let's see how far these stories reach. If this story moved you or gave you chills, give it a like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. One last thing, rate the story from 1 to 10 in the comments. Your feedback helps us bring you even better ones next time. Thanks for watching. We appreciate you being part of this storytelling journey.